Welcome, everybody. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Paula López Peña, who is a postdoc with us in the refugee program here at Yale, presenting her work on the causes and consequences of ethnic violence in Myanmar. Dr. López Peña has been teaching here at the Department of Economics, and her areas of research are applied microeconomics and development economics. She studies how non-cognitive skills and adverse life events affect health and labor market outcomes. Her current projects focus on entrepreneurship, firm productivity, and the causes and consequences of violence. So thank you very much, Paula, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for the introduction and also for hosting this event. We are delighted to be presenting our work on the causes and consequences of ethnic violence in Myanmar today. And here the caveat is today we're going to be presenting results from the decade prior to the beginning of the pandemic. My co-authors are here with me today. Austin Davis from American University, Mushfiq Mubarak from Yale, and Jaya Wen from the Harvard Business School. And we're all looking forward to having your feedback and comments. Feel free to ask me questions directly at any time, just unmute yourself. Or if you prefer, you can just write your question on the chat box and one of us will answer your question as soon as possible. And with that, I'm gonna get started. And I want to start by briefly introducing the context for the persecution of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. As many of you may know, Myanmar is one of the most ethnically diverse countries on earth. And almost since its foundation, it has been torn apart by armed clashes between the different ethnic militias and the state's armed forces, the Tatmadaw. And of all ethnic groups, the Rohingya Muslims stood out for having been the most severely persecuted minority. They were stripped of citizenship in 1982, and ever since then, they have been relentlessly harassed, both by the Tatmadaw and sometimes by their own neighbors next door. Furthermore, there is growing evidence that there has been a sharp increase in the number of violent events targeting Rohingya Muslims since 2011, which was the year in which Myanmar started as a country a transition into democracy. The latest outbreak of violence, the infamous military crackdown that took place in 2017 alone, displaced over 700,000 Rohingya Muslims, the vast majority of whom are currently living in Bangladesh in crowded refugee camps. And one of the facts that we're going to present to you today is that very large proportions of these refugees living in Cox's Bazar is that the vast majority of them report having survived or witnessed physical assault, murder, rape, and arson attacks. And despite how pervasive these narratives are, what happened exactly in the aftermath of the 2017 crackdown and why it happened remains highly contested. And our paper will speak directly to the two predominant narratives and explanations for what happened and why. The first is that of the international community, which primarily agrees that the kind of violence that the Rohingya have been exposed to, especially during and after 2017, are a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. And that the evidence of mass killings and mass gang rapes that they have been exposed to show a clear genocidal intent on the side of the military. On the other hand, the competing narrative is that of the former civilian government of Myanmar, now deposed. Former state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi declared that it was still not easy to establish clear patterns of events and that it's possible that some refugees might have provided inaccurate or exaggerated information. So the bottom line is the government of Myanmar argues that there is no evidence that the persecution of Rohingya Muslims or violence against Rohingya Muslims has been widespread or systematic. Our goal with this paper is to provide quantitative evidence to complement the existing qualitative narratives, those that have been told by refugees themselves and reported by numerous journalistic accounts from reporters in the field. And the two main contributions that this paper makes is, on the one hand, we're gonna exploit a very detailed data set that contains daily data on conflict events from across Myanmar for over a decade. And this makes our conclusions less susceptible to cherry picking and less susceptible to perhaps over relying on arguably inaccurate recollections. And in doing so, what we hope is to provide a descriptive, in-depth set of facts indicative of a long-term methodical pattern on the side of the military and how the military treats differently Rohingya from other ethnic minorities. And importantly, our data will allow us to tell you a causal story on one important driver of violence. And our focus here is going to be that violence has economic motivations. And this side of the story has often been overlooked. In many instances, the conflict has been characterized as being underlined by deep-rooted religious hatred or ethnic tensions. In doing so, we're going to contribute to a very broad economics literature on ethnic conflict and interstate conflict. But our goal with this paper was also to try to contribute to the ongoing policy debate on how the international community could potentially help prevent the military or disincentivize the military from continue to engage in violence against civilians, and perhaps how to inform the humanitarian response to address the psychological toll that these refugees bring with them. The results that we're going to present to you and our story is structured around a three-pronged empirical approach. Firstly, we're going to present you a set of difference in difference regressions that are going to help us establish whether or not there were systematic economic motivations driving ethnic persecution in Myanmar. And the hypothesis we're going to test is that in periods when rice prices are particularly high in regions that are more suitable for rice cultivation, conflict might increase. And if this is the case, this is evidence that there are systematic economic motivations behind violence. The second part of the paper is going to be based on vector autoregressions or VARs. This is a statistical framework that allows us to document how different actors involved in this conflict behave over time and how they respond to one another's action. And this is going to be very helpful for us to compare the way in which the military has treated the Rohingya compared to other ethnic minorities. And lastly, we're going to present you a set of very basic yet hard to come by summary statistics on the prevalence of depression and past experiences with trauma among refugees currently living in Cox's Bazar. And this is to try to paint the enormous human toll of the ethnic persecution we're trying to describe and explain. And we're going to start with the first section, the rise differences in differences approach. Here, as I was saying earlier, the motivation or the goal is to understand whether changes in the international price of rice could lead to an increase or a decrease in conflict in areas that are more suitable for land cultivation, which would then suggest that ethnic violence is underlined by economic motives. And our empirical analysis is going to be based on a series of stylized facts that make it particularly suitable for asking the question at hand. The first is that rice is the most important staple food in Myanmar. It accounts for over 40% of agricultural production. And in particular, most of The rice cultivated in the country is wetland rice, which you can see portrayed in the picture on the bottom left of the slide. Secondly, Myanmar is a price taker on the international global market. Even though it exports a very large fraction of its domestic crop, nearly 10%, the amount is still too small to affect international rice prices. And therefore, this is going to be a core assumption underlying our analysis. Myanmar is a price taker, and hence changes in international prices are going to be acting as an exogenous shock to domestic prices. The last stylized fact that underlines our analysis and that it is going to help us identify the causal effect of changes in prices is the fact that wetland rice has very specific geoclimatic needs. If you look at a map of Myanmar and even within Rakhine State, what you're going to see is that the suitability of different regions, both within the country and within the state, for growing rice is going to vary widely. Here, what we present is an index of suitability of different plots of land, both in Myanmar as a whole and Rakhine, where the Rohingya live. And what this shows is that there is a lot of variation in how suitable some places are for growing rice relative to others. And here we're going to exploit a very rich data set coming from the FAO, the Global Agroecological Zone data set, that contains very fine granular information on how good a certain area is for cultivating and growing rice. And the dimension suitability is going to be composed by a number of variables such as precipitation, temperature, quality soil, etc. Now, our empirical strategy is designed to test two potential mechanisms through which changes in rice prices could affect conflict. The first is the so-called rapacity effect. What this tells us is that if the price of a commodity goes up, that means that the commodity becomes more valuable, and therefore this creates incentives for people to try to appropriate the commodity or even the inputs utilized to produce that commodity. In our context, that would be land. So in this case, a positive shock to the price of rice would increase conflict in areas that are particularly suitable for growing rice. But at the same time, rice is a very labor-intensive crop. It requires a lot of manpower and a lot of human effort. And therefore, it's possible that if the price of the commodity goes up, the salary of agricultural workers growing it increases. And this positive shock to labor income acts as a disincentive to engage in other economic activities that may cost time. For instance, engaging in appropriating or looting rice from someone else, which might also have some form of cost, some form of punishment. So in this case, this is what we call the opportunity cost mechanism. In this case, a positive shock to rice prices has a pacifying effect. And what is interesting about analyzing the effect of shocks to rice prices is that it could go either way. It's possible that there is a rapacity effect in some places and an opportunity cost in other places. And here is when it becomes interesting that we're studying Myanmar. Myanmar is a setting where one of the conflict actors has a much stronger military capability than all other actors that we're studying, that any other ethnic militia. And therefore, what we are going to argue is that in our setting, these forces might be particularly strong, especially in areas that are highly suitable for land cultivation. And this makes ideal our diffs in diffs setup. This is our baseline specification. This is the regression that we're going to run to begin with across the whole country using conflict data from across Myanmar. Our outcomes of interest are described on the left-hand side, the Ys. We're going to focus on three subsets of conflict outcomes. The first is violence against civilians perpetrated by any conflict actor in the country. The second is a subset of that outcome, violence against civilians, in this case perpetrated by state forces. And the last is going to be looting or property damage. And on the right-hand side of the regression, we're going to have an interaction term, the first component of which is land suitability. And this measure summarizes how good a certain township is to grow rice. So this is the average quality or the average level of suitability of land in a certain township to cultivate rice. And this is going to be multiplied by an index of rice prices. And here what we do is aggregating rice prices for the 3 most commonly grown and sold types of rices domestically in Myanmar on a certain month year. So this would be the equivalent to thinking about rice or the average price of rice, for instance, in January 2019. And therefore, the coefficient of interest and the one which we're going to show to you in a couple of slides is beta, the one that is going to capture whether an increase in the price of rice is going to lead to increased conflict in areas that are more suitable for land cultivation. Now, we're going to also add a vector of control variables just to ensure that the fact that some months are always different every year and that some townships are different across the decade that we observe, that these two effects don't bias our estimates. And we're also going to add some controls for latitude and longitude, as well as a dummy variable to control for whether a township is coastal or not. And lastly, we are going to instrument domestic prices using international prices. And this is to address a potentially important source of endogeneity in our setting, which is it's possible, or we have reasons to believe, that the level of conflict in a certain township could affect the price of rice domestically. But we think it's highly unlikely that conflict in a certain township in Myanmar is going to have an effect on international prices. And that's what makes this a very good instrument. Reassuringly, we've tested for the correlation between these two variables. It's very high, so we have a very strong first stage. And just to zoom into how we want to interpret beta, why beta is the coefficient of interest. This is because beta is going to allow us to test our null hypothesis, which is that economic forces do not drive ethnic conflict in Myanmar. And hence, both the magnitude and the significance of beta contain important information for us. If beta is very close to 0, not statistically significant different from 0, then we would not be able to argue based on our data that there exist systematic economic forces driving violence behind the scenes. However, if beta is different from 0, regardless of whether it's positive or negative, we take that as of evidence that there are economic motivations driving ethnic violence in Myanmar. And in particular, if beta is negative, what this tells us is that an increase in rice prices is going to lead to a decrease in conflict in areas that are more suitable for land cultivation, therefore indicating that there are economic forces driving ethnic conflict and that the opportunity cost mechanism dominates. So the shock is pacifying. Conversely, if beta was positive, what this indicates is that in response to a positive shock to international prices, conflict is higher in areas that are more suitable for land cultivation. And what this means is that the rapacity mechanism dominates. So the bottom line, before jumping on the main results table, beta contains important information that allows us to test our null hypothesis. We're gonna just dive into it. Here in this table, each of the columns represent a regression. And the bottom row indicates the outcome of interest of each regression, the left-hand side. Starting with column 1, what this represents is a regression of the number of incidents involving violence against civilians in a certain township in a certain month. And in column 2, we're going to look at a slightly different version of this variable, which is the number of incidents of violence against civilians in a township, but we're going to divide that by the population size of that township in millions. And this is to account for the possibility that conflict is not linear in population size. And lastly, the third column, in the third column, what we're going to represent is a binary variable that takes value 1 if we observe even only one instance of violence against civilians in a certain township month and 0 otherwise. And this is going to help us address concerns over measurement error. Sometimes it's very hard to keep an accurate log of conflict, especially in Myanmar, a country where there is no free journalism, and it's very hard to report what's happening on the ground. So we might think that whether there were 3 or 4 events is not as important as whether there was even one single event in a month. And this is why this binary variable might bring additional information. So this is our beta. This is the coefficient of interest. And what we see is that across the board, beta is positive and statistically significantly different from 0. And if you remember from the previous slides, what this means is that indeed, ethnic conflict in Myanmar is underlined by economic motives, and the rapacity effect dominates. So increases in the price of rice leads to increases in conflict in areas that are more suitable for rice cultivation. And this is true for the 3 main types of conflict events that we consider: violence against civilians by any force, violence against civilians by state forces, and looting and property damage. So this is for the country as a whole. But of course, one of the goals of the paper is to explain what happens within Rakhine State, what happens in the land where the vast majority of the Rohingya live, and see whether these patterns apply in that setting as well. So we reproduce the same regressions, but restricted only to townships in Rakhine State. And this is what we find. The caveat here is that the number of observations drops significantly, and this makes us lose statistical power. When looking at the entirety of Myanmar, we had nearly 34,000 observations. When we restrict our analysis to Rakhine State, we have less than 1,700. And despite this, what we observe is that beta, again, is always positive. The magnitude is very similar to that observed in the analysis at the national level. And in some cases, the coefficient is even statistically significant, even though we've lost a lot of power by restricting our analysis to a narrow geographic area. So we take this as weak evidence that the general pattern that we've seen in Myanmar, economic motives seem to be explaining in part ethnic conflict, seem to apply in Rakhine State. But there seems to be a lot that these alone cannot explain. And this is what we're going to try to tackle in the next section, provide a deeper look into why the Rohingya conflict might be different. And here we've done a bunch of robustness check just to show you that these results are not sensitive to small variations in specifications. And we're happy to go over those perhaps at the end of the presentation in the interest of time. Now, I want to move into the second section in which we show you vector autoregressions, just to remind ourselves what the purpose of this part of the analysis was. VAR offers a statistical framework that helps us understand and document how different conflict variables evolve over time and how different conflict actors respond to each other. The core assumption underlying this kind of analysis is that each conflict variable, say the behavior of the Tatmadaw, the response of the Tatmadaw to an attack by an ethnic militia, is going to be a function of itself and all other variables. So this is to say, how the Tatmadaw decides to respond today to an attack by an ethnic militia is going to depend on the whole history of behavior, of past behavior by the Tatmadaw and the behavior observed in the militia, by the ethnic militia in the past. We are also going to make some additional but fairly reasonable assumptions to shut down reflection problems. The way to think about this is akin to what happened when you face a circular reference in Excel, when the value of two cells that depend on each other cannot be simultaneously determined, and you get an error message. We're going to make just the minimum level of assumptions necessary to prevent this from happening in our case. And here's how we are going to interpret the VAR analysis in our context. We're going to show you a series of graphs that documents what happens on a day when an ethnic militia attacks. How does that ethnic militia behave in subsequent days, whether they keep hitting or whether they retreat completely, and how the Tatmadaw responds over the following 30 days. And this is going to help us establish whether the Tatmadaw treats different ethnic minorities in exactly the same way, or whether they treat perhaps the Rohingya differently. We want to be very upfront in that we're not going to make a causal interpretation for these findings. We're going to think about these graphs as providing an in-depth and useful descriptive account of retaliation patterns, but we cannot make a causal claim. Our data doesn't allow us to establish why ethnic militias may attack in the first place, or why the Tatmadaw might respond in a certain way. What we see in this graph is that following an attack on day one, an attack that is perpetrated by a Rohingya militia, what we observe is that on subsequent days, there are no follow-up attacks. So Rohingya militias attack and then they retreat. We observe that the level of conflict goes back to baseline levels almost immediately. They don't engage on additional conflicts on subsequent days. Now, the graph on the right describes the response of the Tatmadaw to that precipitating event, that initial violent incident in which the Rohingya militia is the perpetrator. And what we observe is that on day one, the Tatmadaw responds to one initial attack, one conflict event, with 1.5 conflict events. And not only that, what we see is that the Tatmadaw not only perpetrates a counterattack, which is 1.5 times as powerful as the initial incident that triggers conflict, but they hit back 1 week later, with almost the same force. So the Tatmadaw does not respond to violent incidents initiated by Rohingya militia on a one-on-one basis, but they respond with disproportionate force immediately and 1 week later. And they continue to engage in smaller counterattacks for a long period of time. And we take this as evidence that the Tatmadaw responds very heavily to a violent incident initiated by the Rohingya militia. Now, the question of interest here is, does this mean that the Tatmadaw is treating the Rohingya in a particularly harsh way, or do they systematically respond to militia attacks regardless of the ethnicity in a similar way? In the paper, we look at how the Tatmadaw responds to the 10 most important ethnic militias based on the number of conflict events in which they were engaged over the past decade. And here, we're going to present you a comparative analysis of the two most important ethnic militias. The first is the Kachin. Understanding how the Tatmadaw treats the Kachin compared to the Rohingya is important because the Kachin is a much more active ethnic militia. They are engaged in a much larger number of conflict incidents than the Rohingya militia, and they are not Buddhists, they are Christians. So one might think that if the conflict is partially underlined by religious hatred, being Christian could be a potential trigger for a disproportionate response. But that's not what we observe. What we observe is that on a day when there is one violent incident in which the Kachin militia is the perpetrator, the Tatmadaw responds immediately, but responds with the same amount of force, responds with exactly one violent event, one violent conflict incident. And then we see that immediately after, both parties retreat. We don't see that the conflict escalates. We see that for as long as we have data for the following few weeks, the conflict goes back to baseline level. They respond to one another with proportionate force. Now, what happens with the Rakhine? The ethnic Rakhine is also a good benchmark in this case because they live in the same state as the Rohingya. The difference between the Rakhine and the Rohingya is that the Rakhine are Buddhist. They are not ethnically similar to the majority Burma of the country, but they are Buddhist. And what we see is similar to what we observe in the case of the Kachin. On days when we observe a violent incident in which the Rakhine militia is the perpetrator, we observe an immediate response by the Tatmadaw, but they respond with proportionate force. They respond to one violent incident with one violent incident. And following this bilateral clash, both parties seem to retreat. The level of conflict falls very quickly back to baseline levels. The conflict does not escalate. So taken together, what these findings suggest is that the way in which the Tatmadaw treats Rohingya Muslims is indeed very different to how they treat other ethnic minorities. And this seems to be in sharp contrast with the argument employed by Aung San Suu Kyi that the violence that we observe is not systematic and it's driven by the whole history of events between the Rohingya ethnic militia and the Tatmadaw. Now, so far, our data and our story has been silent on why the Tatmadaw is treating the Rohingya in such a different way. And here we cannot argue we have a good answer for this question, but our data set can speak to one of the theories for why this is happening that has gained the most traction in recent years. A growing number of scholars, both in South Asia and based outside of Myanmar, have argued that the rising Buddhist nationalism in anti-Muslim sentiments in the general population in Myanmar has allowed the Tatmadaw to systematically target and killing Rohingya Muslims with impunity. And one story that seems to be supported by a number of qualitative studies and even accounts by journalists in the field is that a particular form of hate speech, which is Facebook posts and nationwide protests organized by very highly respected Buddhist monks, have helped spread rumors about Muslims, have stoked fears about a potential Muslim invasion. And this has helped build a narrative about how threatening Rohingya Muslims are. And this has not just justified many instances of communal violence, but has helped the military attack, knowing that there wouldn't be a domestic backlash. What we don't know is whether it's true that this growth in hate speech and this growing number of anti-Muslim protests that were organized by Buddhist monks effectively predict military intervention. We don't know whether these interventions were followed by a crackdown on Muslim civilians. And this is exactly the hypothesis that our data allows us to test. We have a daily log of protests organized by Buddhists and by civilians, both in Rakhine State and Myanmar. And what we observe, what the data tells us, is that for every protest organized by Buddhist monks in which they propagated negative rumors about Muslims, or they tried to make a case that Muslims don't belong in Myanmar, this protest was followed between 10 days and 20 days after by an increase in the number of incidents that are classified as violence against Rohingya civilians and were perpetrated by the TAT model. Again, we want to be very cautious here in describing these results. We cannot claim that anti-Muslim monk protests are causing an increase in the number of violence against civilian incidents perpetrated by the TAT model. What we are trying to suggest is that this evidence seems consistent with the hypothesis that there is an implicit coordination between some sections of the monastic order and the military. And now I'm going to jump to the last section of the analysis, the consequences of the crisis, understood as by this meaning, the enormous mental health toll of ethnic violence on the survivors. And for this part of the analysis, we are going to use data from the Cox's Bazar panel survey. This is a longitudinal study that monitors living conditions and physical and health outcomes in Cox's Bazar. This panel survey is the result of a collaboration between the co-authors of this paper and a number of researchers from the Gage ODI team and the World Bank. We ran a baseline survey between April and July 2019, and what we did was surveying representatives of sample of refugee and local households in Cox's Bazar and asking them a series of questions to assess their experiences with trauma and their mental health. And our instruments contain both closed and open-ended questions, therefore allowing us to look deeper into the data or try to provide an interpretation for what the quantitative analysis was telling us. And here is the first series of stylized facts. What we found is that very large proportions of Rohingya refugees, regardless of the year in which they arrived in Cox's Bazar, had experienced at least one trauma event. Here, I want to bring your attention to column 2. What this tells us is that over 87% of all Rohingya refugees who escaped the 2017 outbreak of violence have experienced at least one trauma event. And nearly 1 of 3 of these refugees have experienced more than 5 trauma events. Now, we have pointed here some of the most commonly reported forms of trauma they have experienced in first person or have witnessed. And when you look at the sample size of the panel and the fraction of refugees who reports having survived near-death experiences or torture or having witnessed the murder of a family member or a close friend, it becomes increasingly difficult to believe the narrative offered by the government that these were isolated events. Nearly 2,000 people in our sample report having survived near-death experiences. Now, if you look at column 3, this contains information about the level of trauma to which previously arrived Rohingya refugees have been exposed. And what we see is that those who arrived even before the most violent outbreak of violence, more than 83% also report having survived at least one trauma event. So even though the fraction of respondents reporting each trauma event seems a little bit lower, in most cases the difference is not significant, what we find is compelling evidence that the violence the Rohingya have been exposed to are not isolated events. And it is highly unlikely that so many people have inaccurate recollections. Now, before moving forward, we wanted to acknowledge a fact that initially got us by surprise, which is very large numbers of Bangladeshi hosts also reported having had experiences with trauma. These are qualitatively different. These, in many instances, these were cases of domestic violence. But what we found was important to communicate is that the Rohingya refugees is a severely traumatized population arriving in a host country where the natives have also been exposed to very traumatizing experiences and therefore might have psychological needs. And this is going to be important for thinking about how to design the humanitarian response. And this speaks about how high priority psychological support services might be in this setting, and not just to refugees. This is the last series of results we're going to present to you today. Unsurprisingly, what we observe is that Rohingya refugees have very high prevalence rates of depression. If we were to aggregate across influxes and across genders, what we observe is that 1 in 3 Rohingya refugees meets the symptom criteria for depression. The prevalence of depression is also very high among hosts. It's 1 in 4, in this case, meet the symptom criteria for depression. And we are gonna show you how this compares with other refugee populations and the general population in the US. And we wanna be clear here that the goal of this comparison is not to try to minimize the experiences of refugees who have been resettled in other countries. This is just to qualify our use of the word high rates of depression. When we mean that the rates of depression in refugee camps are alarmingly high, this is what we mean. They're between 2 and 3 times as high as those among Syrian refugees who have been resettled in high-income countries, survivors of the Fukushima disaster, and 4 times as high as the US general population. And now to conclude, in this paper, we have shown you that the persecution of ethnic minorities in Myanmar has economic motives. We have also shown you that the persecution of Rohingya Muslims is very different, or represent a very different retaliation pattern when you compare to how the Tatmadaw has treated other ethnic minorities. And here we point out a potential reason why the Tatmadaw has gotten away with it, which is there might be an implicit coordination with ultranationalist Buddhist monks. And lastly, we have shown you that all of this matters because the human cost of ethnic violence is very large, both on the refugee population and on the population that they are hosting. Now we have 2 highly vulnerable populations living in a very small area and competing for psychological services that are scarce. And I think I'm gonna conclude here. I promised Teresa that I was gonna finish a bit earlier to leave room for questions and answer. We look forward to your feedback, comments, and suggestions. Thank you very much. So maybe Elizabeth, do you wanna get started? I don't know, Teresa, how do you wanna do this? I would also like to invite my co-authors to join the conversation and answer directly.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much. A number of questions for you. Does anybody take seriously the Burmese government's narratives? So it seems to me to have that to be your overarching takeaway seems, a kind of oddly weak conclusion of a lot of careful inferential work. Now, it may be important to do that for various policy reasons, but it just seems to me that it kind of pulls the punch, so to speak, of what you are demonstrating empirically. A second question is whether the VAR graphs, they don't seem to me to be capturing what on my read of some of the international reports is an attacks initially in 2016, then in August 2017 by the ARSA, followed by a wave of ethnic cleansing violence that pushes the Rohingya away, out, imprisons some, kills many, and so on. And so that there's, by kind of seeing one event and then, okay, it's disproportionate in terms of the count, and it's nice to see a timeline, but that's not one capturing the intensity of the violence, which is usually the way disproportionality is measured, which we know in this case is huge. And also doesn't seem to capture that the way in which these isolated attacks were followed by these waves of forced displacement. So I'd like to understand more how you're seeing those. And then a third question is, can you disaggregate between the economic motives? So you broke out property damage and looting, but not by actor, not by perpetrator, whether that's the Tatmadaw or presumably civilian members of, I don't know, ethnic gangs or something like that. But under the rapacity, you had two different motives, right? One is grabbing rice, and the second is grabbing land. And it would be, just that would seem to be really important to understand in terms of the durability of displacement of the Rohingya. So if you can speak to that, that would be very helpful. And then my last question is a question not about the talk, but about the abstract, which says that there's a line that says that the Tatmadaw use violence against the Rohingya to incapacitate the group, as opposed to merely deterring or responding to attacks from Muslims and militias. And then you say later that, and that you showed very nicely, then you say the Tatmadaw deliberately targets and kills Rohingya civilians, but not civilians of other minority groups. You didn't show that. And, the record of human rights violations in the north and northeast of the Kachin and the other ethnic groups, civilians of those ethnic groups is very long standing. So I'm just wondering what your position is on that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the excellent questions. I'm going to try to address all of them. And thank you very much for the thankful comments. So I'm going to try to go in order. With regards to whether anyone takes seriously the Burmese claims, they do domestically, and to the extent that we believe that having the endorsement of voters and citizens have allowed them to continue these attacks and escalate over time, we thought that it was important to confirm that the international narrative should be believed domestically. We understand you might think it's very naive that we think that this paper might change the perception domestically, but we still felt it was important to say. Now, the comment is well taken in the sense that given the audience we have today, perhaps that was a point that did not need to be emphasized as opposed to others that would have been a better ending. So that point is very well taken. We're also hoping perhaps this paper could help make a case in front of the International Court of Justice. We think that this quantitative approach complements very well the existing qualitative narratives that have been easily disputed or dismissed by the government of Myanmar. So we're hoping maybe that helps make this additional contribution, which is a policy-oriented one. Yes, now moving to the second question. You are absolutely right in that the VARs capture responses on average over 10 years, and therefore the 2017 events are highly diluted and they're to some extent masked. Here, the goal of the VAR was to show that there has been a broader pattern of systematic violence against Muslims before and after the outbreak of violence. Because one of the claims that we are hearing about what motivates this conflict is that there are sudden outbreaks of religious hatred, and then violence escalates and retreats very quickly. And we were trying to offer perhaps a longer term vision for what happened. There is violence ongoing most of the time, even if that goes unnoticed. So the VAR are portraying that average level of conflict over time and how the Tatmadaw retaliates or behaves outside of major outbreaks of violence. But you're exactly right. The VAR don't speak to what happened in 2017. That is exactly right. With regards to the third question, can we disaggregate between economic motives? This is an excellent point. Unfortunately, at the moment, our data does not allow us to distinguish between rice and land grabbing. We fully acknowledge that this is a very important distinction. This is something we're still working on. What we are going to try to do to address this concern that we're taking very seriously is look at the existing maps of what happened to the land that has been expropriated from the Rohingya using satellite data. But this is an ongoing process, is one that we expect is going to take a few more weeks. So we don't have it today, but it's a work in progress. And then with regards to the comment about the abstract, that line, I think, has been removed. We have now changed a little bit how we explain our findings, and we no longer label the motives of the Tatmadaw as incapacitation or retaliation, purely because we acknowledge that our data does not allow us to perfectly answer that question. And then embedded in question number 4, you're absolutely right that our VAR show an average number of attacks on civilians of other ethnic minorities that we're very much aware exist. And these are completely masked because in levels, like when you average out over 10 years, then these seem to be much lower. So this is a clear drawback of using VARs, at least 10 years of daily data to portray or characterize other ethnic conflicts. We do show events in which civilians have been targeted. And I guess that if we were to use a slightly different unit or a different definition, it would pop by that these civilians have also been attacked. At the moment, it doesn't. I need to think a little bit more about how to combine VAR with perhaps other ways of displaying our results such that we paint a better and more accurate picture on what's happening in other states like Kachin. So thank you very much for these excellent comments. I've taken notes. We're going to be working on this over the next coming weeks. Oh, I think Mushfiq is also adding some additional responses. Thank you, Mushfiq. He's complementing what I just said. Yeah. And do we have any more hands? Oh, I see Hannah is. Have you found documented significant improvement? That's a very good question. I want to answer, please let me know if I haven't addressed any of the questions on the chat box. I wanted to answer to the question on whether we have found or documented empirical results on the economic consequences of this ethnic violence, such as the economic or employment loss, presumably among refugees. I would say we have some descriptive statistics, but we are trying to work to produce a new set of preliminary results on this topic. We think it's very important. So I'm going to respond on behalf of Austin, who has been working a lot on this part of the analysis. The short answer is we're working on it, and we will eventually.
So I can just give a little bit of detail on what we find on the economic side. So here, the data again are collected on the Bangladesh side of the border after the displacement, and we collected that, and the displacement occurred in 2017, July 2017. That's when the mass exodus of Rohingya moved into Bangladesh. I should say the latest exodus, because there were prior mass exodus. And so we have data. We collected data on the economic situation of the Rohingya. So let's say the camp population. That's one group. A second group is Rohingya who were already present in Bangladesh prior to 2017. And then a third group is what we call host communities. So Bangladeshis who are living near the camps. And then as a contrast, we also have Bangladeshis living a little bit further away from the camps. Okay? And so the comparison we can draw from these data is how are the Rohingya doing relative to Bangladeshis who live near the camp, right? So because the survey was administered to both those groups. And the other thing we can do is retrospectively ask, okay, what are you doing right now? What do you have right now? What is your employment, income, assets right now? And what was it on, like, say, first quarter of 2017 before the displacement? Okay? And so one of the main things that you learn from that data are that like if you look at the entire distribution of the Rohingya, and let's look before 2017, before they were displaced, right? The entire distribution in terms of income, assets, right, look very similar to the distribution of Bangladeshis living on the other side of the river, in Cox's Bazar and Ukhia district where the camps are, right? If anything, the Rohingya had, the population density on that side of the border is lower, so they had a bit more assets, so a bit more land than Bangladeshis did, say in February 2017. Okay, and then what you observe right after the displacement, like the current situation when we collected that data in 2019, is that the entire distribution of assets, etc., shifts sharply to the left for the Rohingya because they lost a lot, whereas in Bangladesh it remains similar, right? And so what you learn from the data is, one, that like people were like Rohingya and Bangladeshis living on this side of the border near the camps, they were under very similar, comparable economic situations, doing similar things in agriculture, right? And then the Rohingya suddenly lose all of their possessions, and now the distributions look very different, right? So the point of highlighting this is, one, we also have to communicate with my compatriots in Bangladesh on that as attitudes towards Rohingya are changing over time, have changed over time as people have gotten impatient, right? With 1 million people like living in camps in their midst, and people are perceiving a bunch of different problems, and even though we had initially welcomed them. And so, like, to document this, to show to my Bangladeshi compatriots that, look, these are people who are just very similar to us. It's just a bad luck of being on the other side of the river suddenly that they've lost a lot, right? And second is something that we need to do a bit more work on, is like connecting what we see in the loss of assets, right, from pre to post 2017, right, and the consistency of the reports that we're getting in the Bangladesh side of the border with the looting result that Paolo was showing on the Myanmar side of the border.
Okay. There is a question on how we're planning to use the satellite data. I guess the answer is we don't know yet because we're still in the process of downloading it. And we are waiting to see whether we're gonna have, the quality of the image is gonna be good enough for us to be able to run a regression and look at, zoom in and see what happens and see if we find an overlap between those areas and the areas from which our respondents in our data set come from. So that's something that we're looking forward to have our hands on, but we haven't quite used yet.
And to add to Paolo's point, if I may, on Susan's question about satellite data, one particular avenue as well that we can pursue and that we're hoping to is with sufficiently fine-grained satellite data, especially if we have time coverage after the refugees have fled, we can sort of get an understanding of what the land that has been appropriated from Rohingya refugees is now being used for. So for example, is it now land that's being rewilded? Has it been recultivated? And if it's been recultivated, that actually speaks to the potential economic payoff of displacing people from their land. So even if we can't use our economist toolkits, we might be able to do some detective work to speak to the qualitative nature of land use after departure.
For me, I want to thank you for the paper. For me, the value of a quantitative paper and the use of large data sets and remote sensing, for that matter, is that it knits together qualitative information that we have from histories, commentaries, from on the ground, right, observations. I'm thinking, for example, of a 20-year set of documents that the Karen Human Rights Group has been gathering, right, at the border of every incident that has taken place over the last 2 decades, right? It's an unbelievably valuable source. It'll be interesting to coordinate your observations with that meticulous, right, kind of data that is available in an archival sense. And so I'm interested in, there are 2 questions I have. I'm interested in why you hit on the price of rice. I mean, it's easily measurable, right? It's available quite easily. What other economic variables did you consider and reject, and why? The qualitative information that I have with respect to Burma is that the seizure of land, although occasionally it is for irrigated rice land, not just rice land that's suitable, but irrigated rice land, which is much more valuable than rain-fed rice, that most of the seizures and looting have been for minerals, right? The effort to grab land that can be used as plantations, the overtaking of businesses and orchards and so on. And it, at least in the qualitative information that I'm familiar with, the idea of just seizing rice land or looting rice, it appears almost not at all. And if you've got evidence that this appears in the qualitative data as a motivation, I would like to see more of that. The other problem, I suppose, is that you tend to treat the Tatmadaw as a unitary actor. My understanding is that the regional commanders of the Tatmadaw, and that was part of the democratic opening under Thein Sein, was to give them a free hand to grab whatever they wanted and to never bring any corruption charges against them. So we are dealing, as we can see on the streets of Rangoon and Mandalay now, with individual police and army seizing businesses, looting, and so on. So your question of response, let's say, to the Rohingya, the Arsa attack, and so on, there's a lot of your analysis that treats the Tatmadaw as a unitary actor. And I think it is not correct to treat the Tatmadaw as a unitary actor. How that changes your analysis, I haven't quite thought through. The last thing is, it seems to me that, and this is, I don't want to make this sound dismissive, because it's not actually, but I'm wondering how many people on your team read and speak Burmese, right? And how much Burmese sources have played a role in what you've done. Now, there's a workaround for this, and I would like to pose another question then. There are lots of Burmese intellectuals and journalists who've spent several decades working on the Tatmadaw and trying to understand the interior politics of Burma, and you would be well served. People like Min Zin, for one example. These are people who I think, if you run your analysis by them and ask for their comments and criticisms. And if you haven't, I think it is professionally a good thing for you to do.
I was just going to say, thanks, Jim. Would you be able to, like, if we send once the paper is ready, so we're presenting something that's a work in progress. So once it's ready, would you be able to connect us with the right groups who should be reading it? Maybe forward it to them. And you're on mute, Jim. Sorry.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
So I can actually thank you so much for your questions, Jim. It's also personally very gratifying to have you here, because you wrote one of my favorite books on economic development, Seeing Like a State. So it's an honor, frankly. So in terms of what other variables we considered, we actually didn't run any statistical inference on other variables, but we did do the intellectual process of coming to rice, and in particular rain-fed rice. So that process actually involved brainstorming other agricultural commodities or mineral or extractive commodities that we could use a similar type of approach to. with the maps, for example. And so one set of endowments that we did consider were oil, gas, and mineral resources. And after looking at the maps, it just so happened that the geographical spread of those resources was more concentrated than the rice gradient. And it ultimately just became quite a binary variable off of which, frankly, it was a statistical feasibility issue. It just wasn't giving us enough variation to speak with our causal tools. And of course, that's a limitation of our field, frankly. And so we did actually consider this idea about rain-fed versus irrigated rice. And I think we landed on rain-fed rice because it seemed like one of the most broad-based held agricultural assets that Rohingya populations would have access to in the state. However, you bring up a great point, which is that irrigated rice land may be more of a target for expropriation. So we actually have data on that, and we could easily run an additional statistical test using, rather than just rain-fed rice suitability, we could look at rice productivity conditional on irrigation using a very similar technique. So I think that's a fantastic suggestion, and it's implementable, so we'll go out and do it, absolutely.
Thank you, Jay. And I also want to thank James, and I want to speak to the second question about whether we were aware that the Tatmadaw is not a unitary actor. I would say, I think as economists, we don't have the best training on qualitative work coming from South Asia, but I read a few papers by Min Sin myself. And in fact, the part of the VAR analysis that focuses on the connection between ultranationalist monks, hate speech, and military actions comes from the paper by Min Sin titled Anti-Muslim Violence in Burma, Why Now? So that actually Min Sin inspired a very important chunk of this paper. In this particular article, and I'm going to refer to this because it's the one I've read the most times and it's more fresh in my mind, I think that he did not dismiss the possibility or the argument that the Tatmadaw is not a monolithic, but he said, despite the fact that it's not a monolithic, we see systematic patterns that are consistent with what we have described in the paper. Now, I fully acknowledge that we need to complement this analysis to capture in a much more accurate way the dynamics that you have described. Yes, there are some regional dynamics at play. Yes, there are elements of the Tatmadaw response that are clearly decided at a regional level, and we cannot at present fully account for that. Now that you've brought it to my attention very explicitly, I'm gonna get back to the data. I'm gonna have another look at the detailed notes of describing the events that the ACLED data set collects, and I'm gonna try to think about how we can address these comments. So I'm gonna need to think a little bit more about it.
And Jim, can you tell us? I mean, I'm sure the entire audience would be interested. So, what's your history with the engagement in Burma, and when did you start, or what type of work were you doing?
Oh, you forced me to tell you how old I am. I was in Burma before any of you were born. When I finished college, for reasons that are rather humorous, I had failed to go to work on my senior economics thesis at Williams College, and my professor dismissed me because I hadn't done enough work in the fall semester. I'd fallen in love, and I had to have someone adopt me if I wanted to graduate with honors in economics. And I found a professor who was interested in Burmese economic development, and he said if I'd work on Burmese economic development, he would adopt me. And I said, fine. And as I closed the door, I asked myself, where's Burma? I knew it was somewhere out there between India and Thailand. In any case, I wrote a thesis on Burmese economic development, in particular the Napan. There was a 5-year plan that Burma was supposedly following then. In any case, I had a Rotary fellowship because rather than going to law school, and spent a year in Burma, fell completely in love with it, and would have done a dissertation on Burma had it not closed up. And I ended up working in Malaysia because the Malay language is spoken in 4 different Southeast Asian countries. And I knew that at least one of them would be open for field work on the ground. And so I'm in a sense by accident a Southeast Asianist and by accident a Burma specialist. And I've kept up, I've been going back. I'm working on an eco-history of the Irrawaddy River. And I hope to write a small book on the Irrawaddy River in which the life forms of the Irrawaddy River play a bigger role than Homo sapiens. That is, I want it to be a deep history of the river as a life world of different life forms.
Okay, very nice. Thank you.
Sure.
So Teresa, should we call the formal seminar to a close? And
Yes, definitely. Yes, we're on time. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and especially to Paula and her co-authors, all of you, for presenting your results today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.